Unlike some other programming languages, PHP does not support explicit type definition in variable declaration. When variable is declared with the associated value, this is when its type is defined. The example would be, let's say, year of birth. Now that I've typed the variable name, I don't really know what type it is until I associate the value with it, which in this case is going to be represented by 1970, making this variable of the integer type. Next one, let's say first name. I can only assume it's going to be a string, but until I actually associate the value with the variable itself, I don't really know. I can also, let's say, provide a number, and this specific variable will be an integer type now. But obviously, for the first name, it would make sense to put the string. So either in double or single quotes, my name, or your name, obviously. So now we know that this variable is of the string type. Same, let's say, for price. You would think that it's going to be represented by the floating point or integer, but until the value is associated with the variable, you don't really know. Obviously, in this case, it's going to be a floating point. We can convert type of the value by using the plus operator. And let's have a look at the example. We are going to echo year of birth and then plus operator, first name. As you can see, we've got an integer and we're trying to add string to it. Let's have a look at what's going to happen. If we open our browser, refresh, and you can see we only get the value of the integer. The string is nowhere to be found on the page. So let's go back to our editor and see what happened. Basically, when you are adding, using this plus operator, integer to a string, as long as the string doesn't have any number at the beginning, then only integer is going to be returned. If, let's say, I'm going to add 10 at the beginning and then a space between the number and the string inside of this first name string value, then the number at the beginning is going to be added to the integer and the rest of the string is going to be ignored. Let's have a look at this. I'm going to save it and we're going to preview it in a browser once again. If I refresh it now, you can see that this 10 from the string has been taken and added to our 1970, making it 1980. If we now go back to our editor, let's try now and add after this the price as well. Save it and see what's going to happen in the browser. So if we refresh the page, you can see that our integer has now been converted to a floating point. We've got a decimal point here. And obviously, first of all, we took 1970, added 10 from our string, and then 1.7 from our floating point. So let's just summarize what's just happened and how basically the plus operator converts the different data type. If at least one of the values is an integer and the others are string, let's say, then the value is going to be an integer. If at least one of them is the floating point, then the returned value is going to be a floating point. Let's now have a look at the typecasting, and we have already touched the subject when we were discussing variables and when we're trying to convert string and other data types to the Boolean data type. The typecasting basically allows us to change the type of the value associated with the variable to a different data type. Let's have a quickly look at one example. So we're going to create a name variable and we are going to specify the, let's say, some string basically. Let's say SSD tutorials. If I now use var underscore dump function to output the variable, the value associated with the variable together with all its properties, if I now save it and preview everything in a browser, refresh the page, you can see it tells me it's a string, it's got 13 characters, and that's the value associated with it. So if we now go back to our editor, let's now try and convert our string to an integer. So before our string, let's use a set of brackets, space, and inside of the brackets we are going to put either integer or the shorter version, int. And you can use space on either side of the cast as well if you want to. So now if we save it and preview everything in a browser, refresh the page, you can see it tells me it's an integer now and its value is null. When you're converting string into an integer, you simply get null. Unless, and let's go back to our editor, unless I'm going to put some number in front of it. And there doesn't need to be a space. I'm just going to start with the space first so you can see what's going to happen. So if we now save it and preview everything in the browser, refresh, there we go. It picked the number from within the string. So it converted the string into the integer and took the number because there was a number at the beginning and basically use it as a value of this integer. So if we go back to the editor again, now if I concatenate it, basically I just make sure that there's no space, so we still got a number right in front of the rest of the string. If we now save it, back to the browser again, refresh, the result is still the same. Let's try another one. If we now specify the negative value, it's -10, and then SSD tutorials, back to the browser, refresh, there we go, it's an integer, -10. If we go back to the editor, if I now put a string character, alphabetical character, let's say letter A before this -10 and go to the browser, refresh, it goes back to null. Because in order for the casting to pick the integer from within the string, it needs to start with a number, or basically a minus, a plus symbol. If I now move this as well, let's remove this -10 from the beginning, let's put it at the end of the string, it will also ignore it because it doesn't start with it. So again, after refreshing, you still got no. Let's go back to the editor. Let's now try and convert an integer to a string. So 1970, let's say, and we want to convert this specific one to a string. So again, in the brackets, just string. And then followed by the value wants to convert to cast to a string, basically. If we now save it, go back to our browser, refresh it, and as you can see now, the integer, which by default it would be, has been converted into the string. It tells us there are 4 characters within the string. As you can see, this specific value is surrounded by the double quotes to indicate that it's a string as well. If we go back to the editor, if I now remove this preceding typecasting from this value, then if we go back to the browser, refresh it, now you can see it's just an integer with 1970 as the value. If we go back to our editor again, let's try a few other things. I'm going to use Boolean now, so bool or Boolean like this, and we're going to still use just a string, so SSD tutorials, and if we now save it, go back to our browser, you should know what it's going to be by now because we've discussed string into Boolean already. So if we now refresh it, you can see it gives us true, because if there is a value associated, if it's a string and we're trying to convert it to a Boolean, it's always going to be true unless we pass an empty string. If we remove SSD tutorial from within the double quotes, refresh it, now we get false because there's not a single character inside of the string. So let's just reverse it. So as I said, you can use either Boolean full or just shorter version, which is BOOL. And if we go to the browser, you can see again we get Boolean true. Back to the editor. Let's now try and convert it to a floating point. So float. If we save it and let's go back to the browser, refresh it, it gives us null, 0 basically. String when trying to convert the floating point, it simply gives us 0, unless again I'm going to put number 10 here. Let's save it, go back to the browser, refresh it, and there we go, you get 10. If we use decimal point, let's do 10.5, save it, go back to the browser, refresh it, and we get 10.5. As long as string starts with a number of floating point and we are trying to convert it onto the either integer or floating point, double, real, and so on, then it's always gonna pick the basic numerical value from the beginning of the string. Otherwise, it's simply gonna return 0. So that's floating point. We can also use double. If we save it, go back to the browser, refresh it, again, same value. We also have typecast called real. If we save it, go to the browser, refresh. I'm sorry if I'm going a little bit too fast, but these are just basically returning all the time the same things. And chances are you may not even use them that much when it comes to double and real. Probably floating point at some point, but these aren't used very, very much. If we again try to use, let's say, 5.661, let's say, at the beginning of the string, it's still a string, it's not a number, the actual integer. So if we just go back to the browser refresher, you can see it did pick it up again from within the string. And as you can see, it tells us that it's still a float, basically, because real or double, they all evaluate the floating point, basically. So for now, just unless, obviously, if we try to remove these numbers and we're gonna have just a simple number, it still returns float, but obviously without any decimal points. So that's float, double, and real. Let's now try and convert it to array. So array, we haven't discussed array. Arrays are the subject of the next chapter. So pretty soon. Let's remove this number because we don't need it here now. And if we save it and preview everything in a browser, refresh, you can see it tells us now it's an array with one item in it. And it starts with the 0 index, and its value associated with the 0 index is a string with 13 characters, and here is its value. Again, double quotes indicating obviously this is a string as well, even if this string keyword wouldn't be specified here. Just because of the double quote, you would know that it's actually the string value. So let's go back to the editor. What else can we convert our string to? Let's convert it into an object. We won't be discussing objects within this course as it's a more advanced topic, but just to show you basically they can also convert the value to the object. And there we go. You get this std class object with the property scalar and its value associated, basically SSD tutorials, which we've obviously got in our associated with our variable, and it's a string with the 13 characters. What else can we convert it into? One last is the unset, and that basically sets the value, the data type of the specified value to null. So if we now save it, preview in the browser, refresh, and there we go. That's what we get. It's just null. So that's everything about data casting. Obviously, feel free, typecasting, feel free to play with all different data types, basically trying to convert them to different data types using these methods. If you want to find out a bit more about typecasting, if we go back to the browser, navigate to obviously php.net, then /manual, your language, and then you have language.types.type-juggling.php. Or if you are simply on PHP website right from the homepage, type in the search types, hit enter, and that's going to give you a table of contents, and then right at the bottom you have type juggling, and you can obviously read more about what happens when you're trying to concatenate it. And then if you scroll down, you have all these casts which we've discussed just a minute ago. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a better idea of how you can convert between the different data types.